There are crimes in history so horrifying that it's hard to believe they were carried out by ordinary human beings, not on battlefields, not amid the chaos of gunfire, but behind barbed wire fences, where cold authority turned cruelty into daily routine. And perhaps the most haunting truth is that among those who spread terror were women, people who, by appearance alone, no one would have imagined could become symbols of a living hell. In today's video, we step into one of the darkest chapters of World War II, where 3 infamous female guards at Bergen-Belsen were brought to justice after the world witnessed, with its own eyes, the horrifying truth behind the concentration camp. This is a story that grows heavier the deeper you go, but also impossible to look away from. And if you're drawn to historical stories told with depth, honesty, and emotional weight like this, don't forget to subscribe to the History War channel so you won't miss what comes next. The most terrifying thing about the Nazi concentration camps is not that they were places where violence erupted chaotically, out of control, or in sudden bursts of collective madness. What makes them truly horrifying is that everything operated like a system, a machine. A machine with records, orders, ranks, forms, procedures, supervisors, enforcers, reporters, inspectors. Evil here didn't only arrive through screams, gunshots, or beatings. It came through work schedules, administrative discipline, and cold decisions handed down as if running a factory, a military base, or an ordinary government office. When Hitler rose to power and the Nazi apparatus tightened its grip on German society, something incredibly dangerous was established with alarming speed. The idea that violence, if authorized by the state, was no longer a crime, but a duty. From that moment on, imprisoning people without trial, beating them, stripping them of their property, exploiting their labor, even driving them to death, all of it could be packaged in the dry language of security, stability, order, and national protection. That's how the worst atrocities often begin. Not with the explicit language of killing, but with language that sounds rational, cold, and legitimate. From the beginning, the concentration camp system was not built as an outbreak of chaos. It was built as infrastructure. Dachau, opened in 1933, was not just a place to detain people. It was the first prototype of a control model that would later expand into a network spanning nearly all of occupied Europe. From there, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, Majdanek, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and hundreds of other camps became interconnected parts of the same mechanism. Each had different functions, timelines, and conditions, but all served a single logic: to turn human beings into subjects of absolute control. Within that logic, victims no longer existed as individuals with names, histories, families, fears, and dignity. They were reduced to categories: Jews, Romani, political prisoners, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviet POWs, the disabled, opponents, inferior races, lives unworthy of living. Once language had done its work, violence became far easier, because those carrying it out no longer felt they were harming a specific human being. They believed they were solving a problem, eliminating a threat, cleansing an imagined national body. This is the most terrifying turning point of any system of dehumanization. It does not require everyone to become monsters from the start. It only requires them to stop seeing the person in front of them as someone like themselves. Once that happens, actions that would normally provoke moral resistance can be carried out with little internal conflict. A slap becomes discipline. A withheld meal becomes collective punishment. A prolonged roll call in the snow becomes procedure. A train transporting people directly to crematoria becomes logistics. And death itself ceases to be a tragic outcome to avoid. It becomes an expected output of the system. That's why Nazi crimes were not fueled by hatred alone. They were fueled by organizational capacity. This is what makes them distinct and terrifying to this day. Many massacres in history erupt from chaos, revenge, or momentary bloodlust. But here, evil was divided into tasks. There were superiors and subordinates. Those who gave orders, those who planned, those who coordinated trains, those who counted numbers, those who guarded warehouses, those who inspected barracks, and those who simply stood on the platform pointing left or right. Each task, viewed in isolation, might seem small, but together they formed a machine capable of crushing millions of lives while maintaining the appearance of order. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 stands as one of the clearest examples of this bureaucratization of evil. In a short span of time, high-ranking officials discussed the final solution in language that sounded almost clerical. There were no frenzied battlefield speeches, no graphic imagery of bloodshed, only coordination of responsibilities, standardization of procedures, division of authority. And it is precisely this coldness that sends chills down the spine. Because from that moment on, genocide was no longer a series of isolated acts. It became an organized policy with logistics, tempo, and objectives. Auschwitz-Birkenau was where this machinery reached its darkest form of perfection. Trains arrived on schedule. People were separated immediately on the platform. Those still fit for labor were dragged into forced work. The elderly, children, pregnant women, the sick were sent toward death almost instantly. In that space, everything was designed not only to kill, but to strip away every layer of humanity before death. Heads shaved, clothes taken, names replaced by numbers, bodies crammed into barracks, starvation, disease, beatings, insults, treated as filthy objects to be processed. The destruction here was not only physical, it was the destruction of dignity, memory, and the very sense of being a meaningful human being. But it would be a mistake to think all camps operated the same way, or that death only existed where gas chambers stood. Bergen-Belsen represents another kind of hell. Initially, not an extermination camp like Auschwitz, it became, in the final phase of the war, a place of overwhelming overcrowding as other camps were evacuated and the Third Reich collapsed in panic. Tens of thousands of emaciated bodies were crammed into an already overloaded space. There was not enough food, clean water, medicine, sanitation, or burial capacity. Disease spread like an invisible death sentence. And here, another horrifying truth of the Nazi system revealed itself. It did not always need to kill actively through advanced technology. Sometimes, it only needed to create and maintain conditions in which people would slowly die. Just let them go hungry a few more days, leave the corpses uncollected, refuse to treat typhus, force them to stand for endless roll calls in freezing cold, continue cutting rations from barracks that had nothing left to give. When a system accepts that certain groups are not worth saving, organized indifference itself becomes a form of killing. At this level, the role of lower and mid-ranking personnel becomes especially crucial. Victims did not live day to day with Hitler or Himmler. They lived with the faces they saw repeatedly, outside the barracks, on the roll call grounds, at food distribution points, along pathways and infirmaries near the fences. These were the daily embodiments of power. They decided whether a prisoner would be beaten today, attacked by guard dogs, denied food, forced to stand until collapse, or sent to the line that led to death. At this level, evil no longer takes the form of grand speeches. It lives in small gestures, repeated endlessly. And because the system needed to function at the level closest to the prisoners' bodies, it could not rely on men alone. In women's sections, in barracks designated for female prisoners, in spaces where the regime sought to control even sleep, meals, breathing, and fear, the Nazis required another force. Women willing to wear the uniform, accept authority, suppress empathy, and become extensions of the machine. And to understand why they emerged, why they were recruited, trained, and empowered within a system dominated by men, we must move to the next question. Why did the Nazis need female guards? When people think of the Nazi concentration camp system, most tend to picture men in SS uniforms, the heavy boots striking the ground, the sharp, emotionless commands, the guns, the skull insignia, and an iron discipline enforced through fear. But if we only see it that way, we still haven't grasped the full, terrifying completeness of that system. Because to control every aspect of life inside the camps, especially in the women's sections, the Nazi regime could not rely on men alone. It needed women standing at the closest possible distance to the bodies, the fear and the exhaustion of female prisoners. It needed hands that could search, monitor, beat, escort, conduct roll calls, punish, select, and enforce discipline within barracks where most victims were women. In other words, for the machine to run smoothly down to every corner, the Nazis needed female guards not as a side component, but as a functional and essential link. On the surface, the reasoning sounds simple, almost technical. Within the internal logic of the SS, it was considered inappropriate in certain aspects for men to directly manage the daily lives of female prisoners. The regime needed women to conduct body searches, supervise living quarters, enforce schedules, control hygiene, labor, movement, and punishment in spaces where women were the primary subjects. But that outward practicality conceals something far deeper. The Nazis didn't just need people to maintain order. They needed individuals who could make victims feel that there was nowhere to escape the regime's power, not even in spaces that should have felt closest to their own identity and gender. This point is crucial. For a female prisoner, terror did not come only from male SS officers, like from guards along the fences, or from distant commands issued by an unseen chain of authority. It also came from the women who walked in front of them every single day. Women who could look at them with cold indifference, pull them out of line, cut their food rations, slap, kick, whip, unleash dogs, or simply stand there, calmly watching them collapse without the slightest trace of compassion. That proximity made female guards extraordinarily effective tools of the system. They didn't just enforce discipline, they made discipline feel intimate, constant, and inescapable. But to truly understand why the Nazis needed them, we have to look deeper into the nature of the regime itself. Nazism was not just a dictatorship that used violence to suppress. It was a system that sought to restructure society entirely, based on racial hierarchy, gender roles, and absolute loyalty to the state. Within that structure, racially pure German women were mobilized into various roles, bearing children for the nation, raising the next generation, working on the home front, serving state institutions, and in this case, participating directly in the machinery of imprisonment. In other words, even if women were not placed at the highest levels of SS leadership, the regime still readily used them as instruments of power wherever their presence was required. What makes this so disturbing is that the Nazis did not see it as a contradiction. On one hand, they glorified the image of the German woman as mother, caretaker, and servant of the nation. On the other hand, they could place those same women in positions where they supervised, beat, and helped drive others to death, as long as the victims had been excluded from the category of people worthy of protection. This was the core logic of the regime. Morality applied only to those considered part of us. For those labeled as Jews, Slavs, Romani, communists, dissidents, or inferior races, all moral limits could be suspended. That is why the creation of female guards did not begin with a whip or a uniform. It began with ideology. Before a woman could beat another woman without feeling that she was betraying her own gender or shared humanity, she first had to be taught not to see the other person as someone like herself. This is the key. In the normal world, human similarity is often the first barrier against violence. A mother sees another mother. A young woman sees another young woman. A sick person sees another sick person. But in the Nazi system, that sense of similarity was attacked from the very beginning. Prisoners were no longer women, mothers, daughters, human beings who were hungry, cold, and in pain. They were redefined as parasites, threats, filth, enemies, obstacles. Once that redefinition took hold deeply enough, violence became not only possible, but justifiable. Ravensbrück, the largest concentration camp for women in Nazi Germany, clearly illustrates this process. It was not only a place of imprisonment, it was also the main training center for female guards who would later be deployed across various camps. There, they learned regulations, formation control, roll calls, guarding, escorting, handling violations, using trained dogs, and maintaining discipline. But beneath those procedures lay a deeper psychological conditioning. Learning to become accustomed to cries of pain, to stand unmoved before suffering, to treat prisoners' agony as a normal part of the job. Cruelty did not always erupt all at once. Often it was formed through repeated exposure until witnessing another human being's collapse no longer triggered any internal response. It must also be said clearly, the Nazis did not recruit female guards only from those who were already monsters. Their power lay in the fact that they didn't need to. They recruited ordinary women through very ordinary paths: job advertisements, referrals, transfers, wartime hiring. Many came from poor backgrounds with limited education and few opportunities for advancement. In an increasingly militarized Germany, where war disrupted every aspect of labor, the uniform offered wages, housing, better rations, a sense of stability, and above all, power. For a young woman raised in uncertainty, the experience of having others stand at attention when she passed, fear her voice and submit to her decisions was no small temptation. This is one of the most painful truths when looking back at history. Many people do not enter into atrocity because they begin with a desire to kill. They enter because of status, survival, advancement, a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves, a desire to escape a life of hardship, or simply because that door opened at the very moment all others closed. But once inside, they are placed in an environment where compassion is seen as weakness, harshness is rewarded, and the ability to inflict pain on others becomes a sign of competence. The system does not just recruit people, it reshapes them. It is estimated that around 3,700 female guards served within the Nazi concentration camp network from 1939 to 1945. That number alone speaks volumes. These were not isolated anomalies. This was a real layer of personnel, trained, assigned, ranked, and functionally integrated into the system. For the victims, they were not shadows at the margins. They were faces seen every day, people who directly determined the level of suffering in each moment of survival. What makes this phenomenon even more haunting is that the violence carried out by many female guards did not always resemble the kind of male brutality people typically imagine. It was often closer, more consistent, more routine, not always explosive rage. Sometimes it was cold cruelty, repeated with rhythm, a slap delivered on schedule, a beating justified by reason, a ration cut as a disciplinary measure, a dog unleashed not out of loss of control but because it was necessary to maintain fear. In survivors' testimonies, the horror was not only in the physical pain, it was in the calmness of those who inflicted it. A face without anger, a voice without shouting, a gaze that treated everything as normal. That is the moment when evil reaches its most terrifying form. No longer a burst of animalistic instinct, but a complete integration into the habits of daily work. When a person can beat another as if completing a task, when they can look at a starving, trembling body and feel nothing but inconvenience, when they can decide who lives and who dies as if processing a list, then the machine has succeeded. It has not only controlled the victims, it has also taken control of how the perpetrators perceive their own actions. Among those thousands of female guards, some remained obscure links in the chain. Others became symbols. Some were haunting for their youth, others for their cold administrative detachment. Some terrified prisoners so deeply that their nicknames were remembered more vividly than their real names. And from here, the story begins to narrow in on one specific face, one of the most shocking, one that most clearly reveals how youth, power, and emotional detachment can be compressed into a chilling form of cruelty. That name is Irma Grese. Irma Grese entered history not only because of what she did, but because of the almost unbearable contrast between her age and the level of her cruelty. When people first hear her name, the natural reaction is disbelief. A girl barely in her 20s with a youthful face, blonde hair, a healthy appearance. How could she become one of the most terrifying symbols of the concentration camp system? But that very question opens the most important door to understanding this story. Because Irma Grese was not some bizarre exception outside the logic of her time. She was an extreme but very real product of the system that created her. Irma was born in 1923, growing up in a Germany that was changing at a dizzying pace. It was a society that had just endured defeat in World War I, suffered economic bachan, hyperinflation, unemployment, and then was swept into a wave of political extremism. To a child, none of this appears as historical analysis. It appears as environment, as the air you breathe every day. As Nazism gradually took control of education, media, and youth organizations, an entire generation grew up in a world where ideas of race, obedience, and hostility were planted early. Irma was not an exception to that generation. She joined the regime's youth organizations, where girls were taught not only their roles in society, but how to see the world through a Nazi lens. There, loyalty to the nation was not a personal choice, it was a duty. And while adults might still retain some degree of doubt, for the young, it could easily become an unquestioned truth. But ideology alone is not enough to explain Irma's path. There were also very ordinary factors at play. She left school early, worked on a farm. At one point, she wanted to become a nurse, a profession associated with caring for others, but she was rejected. This seemingly small detail carries significant weight. Because it reveals a missed turning point. A door leading toward care was closed, and almost immediately another door opened, the door to power. At 18, Irma chose to join the female auxiliary of the SS. This was not a random decision. For a young woman in her position, the uniform offered many things at once: stable work, income, social status, a sense of belonging to something larger, and above all, direct power over others. Notably, according to some records, even her father, despite having ties to the Nazi Party, opposed her decision. If true, this only highlights a deeper paradox. Even within a society shaped by the regime, there were still individuals who sensed that some boundary was being crossed. But Irma crossed that boundary. After a short period of training at Ravensbrück, she was transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1943. And it was there that Irma Grese truly became the person history would remember. Auschwitz was not just a concentration camp. It was where the machinery of destruction operated at its highest scale and intensity. In that place, nearly all normal moral standards were erased. Tens of thousands of people were crammed into overcrowded barracks, living in hunger, disease, cold, and constant fear. In such an environment, those in power were not just maintaining order. They were deciding the boundary between life and death. Irma adapted to that environment with terrifying speed. In a short time, she rose to a high-ranking position among the female guards. At only around 20 years old, this was no accident. It showed that her behavior was not seen as abnormal by her superiors. On the contrary, it was considered effective. In a system where cruelty was treated as competence, those who demonstrated it were given more power. Witness testimonies after the war describe Irma with a striking consistency. Young, healthy, confident, walking calmly, a braided whip in hand, a pistol at her side. But what made her truly haunting was not just her appearance, it was how she used her power. Many witnesses recalled that she directly participated in selections on the arrival platform. When trains arrived amid chaos and screams, she pointed, one side for labor, the other for death. What made this terrifying was not only the act itself, but the state of mind behind it. No anger, no hesitation, no confusion, just a cold calmness, as if carrying out a familiar procedure. It was this complete absence of inner conflict that haunted witnesses more than any blow of the whip. Irma was also known for beating prisoners during roll calls that lasted for hours. In brutal weather conditions when many were already too weak to stand, even the smallest mistake, stepping out of line, collapsing, reacting too slowly, could result in a beating. And importantly, many testimonies indicate that these acts did not occur only under supervision. They happened even when no one was forcing her. This reveals a critical point. The violence was no longer just obedience to orders. It had become a personal choice. In Auschwitz, where death was present every day, people could become numb to it. But in Irma's case, that numbness seemed to go a step further. It was not just familiarity with death. It was active participation in creating it, without visible signs of inner struggle. Some witnesses even claimed she occasionally showed a kind of satisfaction in inflicting pain, though the extent of this remains debated among historians. But even without that, the confirmed accounts alone are enough to paint a chilling portrait. In early 1945, as the war neared its end and Auschwitz was evacuated, Irma was transferred to Bergen-Belsen. If Auschwitz was an organized killing machine, then Bergen-Belsen at this point was a hell of collapse. Order had broken down, resources were gone, disease spread uncontrollably, people died in masses without the need for gas chambers. There was only hunger, illness, and neglect. Yet in that collapse, one thing became clearer than ever. Irma's behavior did not change. She continued beating prisoners, moving among the dead and dying with the same calm demeanor, treating inmates as if they were objects without value. If anyone had tried to argue that environment alone forced people into such roles, then at Bergen-Belsen, where the structure itself was falling apart, her consistency became powerful evidence that it was no longer just a role. It was a choice that had been fully internalized. When British forces entered the camp on April 15, 1945, survivors recognized her almost immediately. That fact speaks volumes. In a sea of exhausted bodies, where tens of thousands of faces blurred together, some faces could never be forgotten. Not because they stood at the top of power, but because they were present every day in the suffering of the victims. Irma was arrested, put on trial in Lüneburg, and ultimately sentenced to death. On December 13, 1945, she was executed at just 22 years old. According to records, her final words were, "Quickly." A short sentence, but one that has made people reflect ever since. Was it defiance, emotional numbness, or simply the result of someone who had become so accustomed to death that she no longer experienced it in any normal way? No one can answer that with certainty. But one thing is clear. Irma Grese cannot be understood merely as an individual aberration. If we see her only as a monster, we miss the most important lesson. She was the product of a system that knew how to combine ideology, opportunity, power, and environment to create people capable of doing the unthinkable. But if Irma represents a form of violence that is direct, visible, marked by personal imprint, and haunting because of its contrast with youth, then within the same system existed another type, arguably even more dangerous, at a deeper level. A type that did not need to display emotion, stand out, or draw attention, yet could sustain and organize death as part of daily work. And to fully understand how that machinery operated, we must turn to another face, Elisabeth Volkenrath, a woman who turned violence into administration and death into a chillingly routine procedure. If Irma Grese makes people shudder because of the contrast between her youth and the directness of her cruelty, then Elisabeth Volkenrath opens the door to a different kind of fear, deeper, quieter, and harder to detect. It is the fear of a person who does not need to stand out, does not need to be violent in an obvious way, does not need to display any extreme emotion, and yet can still help sustain a system of mass murder. In Elisabeth, evil does not erupt. It functions. It does not scream. It organizes. And for that very reason, it becomes dangerous in a far more silent way. Elisabeth was born in 1919 into a family whose father was a schoolteacher. Her background carries few signs of a childhood shattered by trauma or pushed toward extremism by obvious personal upheaval, as in Irma's case. No major family tragedy appears in the record. No early psychological rupture seems to have shaped her from the beginning. At first glance, that can make her case even harder to understand. Because if someone was not cornered by circumstance, not distorted by visible wounds, then why would they still walk into such a system? And that is precisely why Elisabeth's case matters. It reveals a difficult truth. Human beings do not always need a tragic reason to enter into crime. Sometimes all they need is an open path, an opportunity for advancement, a clear structure of power, and an environment where acts that would normally be considered inhuman are legalized and rewarded. In 1941, at the age of 21, Elisabeth joined the female auxiliary branch of the SS and trained at Ravensbrück. From there, she was assigned to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where in the years that followed, she did not remain a simple guard. She gradually rose into a position of real authority within the female guard system. This is an important difference from Irma. If Irma is haunting because of the direct, visible acts that are easy to recognize, Elisabeth appears instead as a coordinator, an organizer, a person who kept the machine running smoothly. At Auschwitz, Elisabeth eventually became the senior figure over the female guards, responsible for managing hundreds of personnel in the women's camp. That meant she not only had the authority to give direct orders, but also the power to shape how violence was carried out across the entire section under her control. She did not need to beat every prisoner herself in order to create suffering. A single decision, a single directive, a single disciplinary practice applied broadly could send consequences rippling through dozens, even hundreds of people at once. That is the essence of administrative evil. It does not need to be loud, it only needs to be effective. Many post-war witness testimonies describe Elisabeth as cold, emotionally restrained, but firm and capable in her command. She could personally beat prisoners and take part in individual punishments, but what made her responsibility even heavier lay in collective decisions. In the conditions of Auschwitz, where food rations were already so low that people wasted away day by day, cutting rations for an entire barrack was not just a punishment. It was almost a drawn-out death sentence. It did not kill immediately, but it steadily stripped away the ability of dozens of people to survive at the same time. And what is terrifying is that decisions like these did not need to come with rage. They could be delivered in an ordinary tone, as part of the job. A barrack had violated regulations. a group of prisoners was considered non-compliant. A collective punishment was imposed. No emotional outburst, no visible torment, only the logic of the system. The prisoner Dr. Ada Bimco described Elisabeth as someone who understood very well the consequences of her actions, yet continued carrying them out with complete calm. That is the key point. In Irma, one can see a form of violence marked strongly by personal impulse, almost instinctive in nature. In Elisabeth, one sees another kind, conscious, calculated, organized violence. It does not come from an outburst. It comes from accepting that other people's suffering is a necessary cost of keeping the system in motion. One detail that may seem ordinary but carries great meaning is Elisabeth's marriage to an SS officer during her time working in the camp. In the same space, behind the fences, people were starving, dying of disease, being beaten, being sent into gas chambers. And in front of those fences, in the staff area, life still went on. There were homes, gardens, social visits, relationships, even marriage. That reveals a terrifying psychological split. Human beings could live a private life that looked normal, even peaceful, right beside a machinery of destruction they were helping to operate. This is one of the most haunting paradoxes of the concentration camp system. It did not only kill people, it allowed those doing the killing to continue living a normal life alongside their actions. When the boundary between those two worlds no longer collides, when a person can order the ration cuts of dozens of prisoners and then return to their quarters as if nothing has happened, evil has reached a dangerously stable form. In early 1945, as the war moved toward its end and Auschwitz was evacuated, Elisabeth was transferred to Bergen-Belsen. There, she held the highest position in the female guard system during the camp's most catastrophic phase. If violence at Auschwitz had still been organized through a clear structure, then at Bergen-Belsen, everything was collapsing. The number of prisoners far exceeded capacity. Food was almost gone. Disease was everywhere. Corpses were left unburied. The living lay among the dead. In that situation, the question was no longer who personally beat how many prisoners. The question became, with the power a person had, what could they do to lessen the disaster? And what did they actually do? In Elisabeth's case, the answer the court later gave was clear. She did nothing of consequence. This is an extremely important point, both legally and morally, because it opens up a principle that later became foundational in international law. In some circumstances, failure to act is also a form of responsibility. When a person has the authority to intervene, has the ability to reduce suffering, and does nothing, they are still helping sustain the crime. During the final months at Bergen-Belsen, many testimonies indicate that Elisabeth continued enforcing discipline through violence, continued imposing punishments, continued running the women's camp as part of the machinery, even as total collapse raged all around her. That highlights a stark reality. Even when the larger system is falling apart, the behavioral habits it has planted in people can continue to survive. When British forces entered the camp, Elisabeth was arrested along with many other guards. At the Lüneburg trial, she argued that much of what happened had been beyond her control, that the situation had descended into chaos, that she was only one link in a much larger circumstance. But that defense did not persuade the court, because her position made it clear that she was not some nameless individual. She was a person with real authority in the area she oversaw. On December 13, 1945, Elisabeth Volkenrath was executed. There were no striking last words, no emotional explosion, just a quiet ending, almost in keeping with the way she had existed throughout the story, cold, controlled, and never loud. If Irma Grese drew the world's attention because of the extremity people could easily see, Elisabeth Volkenrath reminds us of something even more frightening. Evil does not have to look violent. It can exist in the form of efficiency, in the form of responsibility, in the form of just doing the job. And when it puts on the mask of professionalism, it can go much further before anyone fully recognizes it. But even those two models still do not capture all the ways violence could exist within the concentration camp system. Because there was still another kind, not young like Irma, not managerial in the way Elisabeth was, but marked by something so distinctive that victims remembered her by a haunting nickname more than by her real name. A woman whose method of spreading fear did not rest mainly in words or orders, but in animals trained to become instruments of violence. And to complete the full picture, we have to turn to the story of Johanna Bormann, the woman with the dogs. If Irma Grese represented a young generation pulled into extremism from a very early age, and if Elisabeth Volkenrath showed how evil could be organized and operated like a cold, efficient system, then Johanna Bormann opens up a different angle. Quieter, but no less horrifying. She was not young. She did not stand out for her appearance. She was not at the top of the administrative hierarchy. But that is precisely what makes her story harder to look away from. Because Johanna cannot be explained simply by youth, by inexperience, or by being swept up in a crowd. She entered the system as a fully grown adult, old enough to understand the world, experienced enough to compare, and conscious enough to choose. Johanna Bormann was born in 1893. When she was captured in 1945, she was 51 years old. That means she had lived through historical eras that younger women like Irma had never known. She grew up under the German Empire, lived through the First World War, witnessed the collapse of an old order, passed through the chaos of the Weimar Republic, through hyperinflation, unemployment, and social instability. None of that was just background. It was lived experience. It gave a person a very real sense of order and disorder, of stability and collapse. And for that reason, when someone like Johanna chose to enter the Nazi apparatus, that choice carried a different weight. It was not the step of someone who had never known any other world. It was the step of someone who had seen much and still chose this path. Johanna joined the female auxiliary branch of the SS in 1938 when she was already 44 years old. That date cannot be ignored. By 1938, this was no longer a moment when people could claim they knew nothing about the nature of the regime. Kristallnacht had already happened. Jews had already been attacked in public. Thousands had been arrested. Synagogues had been burned. The signs of a violent system were already unmistakable. When an adult entered the machinery at that point, it became very difficult to argue that they had simply wandered into it by accident. From the earliest camps and then later at Auschwitz in 1942, Johanna gradually became someone survivors remembered not because of her rank, but because of the way she created fear. In a system where violence took many forms, Johanna became tied so closely to one particular method that it turned into a nickname, the woman with the dogs. This was not a symbolic image, it was reality. The German shepherds trained inside the camps were not merely guard animals, they were turned into weapons. And Johanna was one of the people who used them systematically. According to the testimony of many witnesses at the post-war trials, she regularly ordered dogs to attack prisoners in all kinds of situations. There did not have to be some major offense. All it took was an act considered improper, a step taken too slowly, a body too weak to keep its balance, a reaction that was not quick enough, an attempt to move closer to food, a sick person lying on a bunk and failing to move when ordered. Across those testimonies, one terrifying pattern stands out: consistency. People from different barracks who did not know one another described the same sequence: a short command, the dog lunging forward, screams, blood, and then a slow death from infection, from fever, from a body no longer capable of fighting back. In camp conditions where medicine barely existed, a bite was not simply an injury. It was the beginning of an ending that had already been set in motion. What made this method especially cruel was not only the physical damage it caused, it was the psychological terror. A human being can understand, and in some cases even predict, the behavior of another human being. But when facing an animal trained to attack on command, fear becomes more primitive, more instinctive. It breaks through the mind's last defenses. When a prisoner stood in line, they did not fear only the whip. They feared something that could lunge at them at any moment, for reasons they could not fully understand. Johanna did not use only dogs. She also took part directly in other acts of violence, beatings, punishments, and selections at Auschwitz. But it was her use of dogs as a familiar part of her behavior that gave her a distinct mark. It was no longer an occasional tool, it became a style. At this point, an important question arises. What made a middle-aged woman with substantial life experience behind her become so bound to this kind of violence? There is no simple answer. But in Johanna's case, it seems clear that the system did not merely create the behavior. It amplified what was already there. If in younger women like Irma, we can clearly see the process of being shaped from the beginning, then with Johanna we see something different. A grown adult finding within the system a place where cruel impulses could be unleashed and legitimized. In early 1945, Johanna too was transferred to Bergen-Belsen. And here, something especially revealing happened. If Auschwitz still functioned within a clearly organized structure, then Bergen-Belsen in its final months was a structure almost completely falling apart. There was no longer enough food, no longer enough control, no longer any real ability to maintain order in the old way. In some cases, the collapse of a system can lead to a reduction in violence when those carrying it out are no longer being driven by discipline from above. But with Johanna, according to witness testimony, that did not happen. She continued her old behavior. She kept using dogs. She kept beating people. She kept maintaining fear. And that highlights an extremely important point. Once a behavior has become part of a person, it no longer needs the system in order to survive. The system is only the environment that helps it form and grow. But once it has taken root, it can continue even as that environment begins to collapse. When British forces entered Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, Johanna did not disappear into the crowd. Survivors recognized her almost immediately. That speaks to a simple but haunting truth. There are faces victims cannot forget, not because they appeared only once, but because they were the fear repeated every single day. What came before Johanna's real name in the memories of survivors was not her title. It was her nickname. The woman with the dogs, a name that needed no explanation. A name that alone was enough to bring the entire experience of terror rushing back. Johanna was arrested, brought to trial in Lüneburg, and ultimately sentenced to death. According to some records, in her final moments she showed fear more openly than Irma or Elisabeth did. It is a small detail, but one that leaves people thinking. Someone who had once stood over others with absolute power, who had made other people tremble, finally faced her own death as an ordinary human being, with fear in her body. 3 women, 3 different paths, one young, one administrative, one middle-aged, but all of them meet at one common point: absolute power over people who had been stripped of every ability to defend themselves. And when that power is no longer limited by humanity, it can take any form, from a leather whip to an administrative order to the teeth of a trained animal. But no matter how different their personal stories were, they all converged at one moment the world could no longer turn away from. The moment when everything that had happened behind the barbed wire could no longer remain hidden. The moment when outsiders stepped in and saw with their own eyes what had previously existed only in rumors, in scattered reports, in fragments of information not yet complete. That moment came on April 15, 1945, when British troops entered Bergen-Belsen, and hell was seen in full before the eyes of the world for the very first time. April 15, 1945 was not just a date in military history. It was a moment when the world was forced to confront a truth that, until then, despite reports, testimonies, suspicions, no one had fully grasped. When British soldiers entered Bergen-Belsen, they were not stepping into a battlefield in the usual sense. There were no burning tanks, no defensive lines, no bursts of gunfire. Instead, they walked into a space where death had become the normal state of existence. The first impression was not visual, it was the smell. A thick, suffocating stench that hung in the air, clinging to clothes, to skin, to the lungs. The smell of corpses, of decay, of disease, of bodies left uncared for over days and weeks. These were soldiers who had seen war, who had encountered death, who had smelled the aftermath of battle. Yet many later admitted they had never experienced anything like this, because here, death was not confined to one place. It was everywhere. As they moved deeper into the camp, the scene revealed itself. Rows of barracks, rotting and overcrowded beyond imagination. Pathways turned to sludge, not from rain, but from a mixture of mud, garbage, and human waste. And then the bodies, everywhere. On the ground, along the paths, beside the barracks, piled together in shallow pits not yet covered. Some were dead, some were not. And in many cases, a soldier could not tell the difference without stepping closer. Around 60,000 people were still alive at that moment. But alive did not mean what we usually think it means. Many were nothing more than skeletons wrapped in skin, hollow eyes, gray, lifeless flesh, bodies without the strength to stand. Some lay motionless, but when approached, their eyes would open, their breath still faintly present, their bodies trying to move, clinging to the last fragments of life. Some were too weak to speak. Some could not even cry for help. And some, upon seeing the British soldiers, tried to raise a hand, not to celebrate, but simply to prove they were still there. Everywhere, there were unburied corpses. It is estimated that over 10,000 bodies lay scattered throughout the camp when the British arrived. Some lay alone, others in heaps. There were mass graves already dug, but not enough people left to cover them. In some barracks, the living and the dead lay side by side, with no clear boundary between them. Some had died in the night, and by morning their bodies remained where they fell, because no one had the strength left to move them. What Bergen-Belsen revealed was not an industrialized killing system like the gas chambers. It was another form of destruction, slower, filthier, and in some ways, closer to the complete collapse of humanity. This was a place where death did not require a direct order. It only required neglect. Hunger prolonged, disease allowed to spread, everything left to continue for just a few more days, a few more weeks. Richard Dimbleby, the BBC reporter who entered the camp with British forces, recorded one of the most shocking accounts of the 20th century. He described emaciated bodies, lifeless eyes, hands reaching out in desperation. But at one point, he could no longer maintain the steady voice of a journalist. His voice broke. He began to cry during the broadcast. And that breakdown made his report more powerful than any carefully chosen words, because it revealed that some realities go beyond the observer's ability to remain detached. This was the moment when the outside world could no longer look away, no longer dismiss it as rumor, propaganda, or exaggeration. Bergen-Belsen was not only seen, it was documented, in photographs, in film, in testimony. And from that point on, it became undeniable evidence. But even within that hell, something else began to happen. The survivors, exhausted, sick, barely holding on to life, began to do something that would later become the foundation of justice. They pointed, they identified those who had ruled over them, those who had beaten them, those who had cut their rations, those who had set dogs upon them, those who had pointed during selections. Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, Johanna Bormann, and many others. In a place where everything had collapsed, that act of pointing became one of the first signs that moral order was beginning to return. For the British, the first days at Bergen-Belsen became a race against time. They set up field hospitals, they tried to separate the living from the dead, they brought in food, water, medicine, but very quickly they realized that saving lives here was unlike any mission they had faced before. Many were too weak. Their bodies could no longer process normal food. Feed them too quickly, and they might die. Do nothing, and they would also die. It was tragedy, layered upon tragedy. Freedom had arrived, but the body could no longer receive it. In the weeks after liberation, more than 13,000 people still died, despite receiving care. That number reminds us of something crucial. Death at Bergen-Belsen did not end when the gates were opened. The consequences endured, in bodies, in disease, in exhaustion accumulated over too long a time. The British were also forced to make a difficult decision. Many barracks had to be burned completely to stop the spread of typhus. That meant the physical spaces that had imprisoned tens of thousands were erased almost immediately. But before doing so, they photographed, filmed, documented, and collected whatever records remained. They understood that what they were witnessing was not just a humanitarian disaster, it was a crime that needed to be proven. And from that moment, a crucial transition began. What had happened at Bergen-Belsen could not end with relief efforts. It had to move into another framework, a framework where these acts were named for what they were, where those responsible could not disappear into the crowd or hide behind the excuse of just following orders. Testimonies, images, documents, surviving records, all began to be gathered. From a place of death, Bergen-Belsen began to transform into a repository of evidence. And from that evidence, an unavoidable question emerged. If the world had now seen, known, and understood what had happened, what comes next? How do you turn memory into responsibility? How do you move from witnessing to judgment? The answer began to take shape not long after, in a small town in Germany. A place where, for the first time, not only those at the very top of power, but also those who had carried out death day after day inside the camps, would be called to account before justice. That place was the Lüneburg trials. On September 17, 1945, inside the town hall of Lüneburg, a place once associated with routine administrative procedures, history began to do something very different. It began to call evil by its human names. No longer grand slogans, no longer speeches about war, no longer strategic maps. Here, justice moved to a deeper level. It entered the barracks, the roll calls, the ration lines, the whip strikes, the dogs, the fingers pointing left or right. It examined small, repeated actions, the very actions that together had built a vast machinery of destruction. What made this trial unique was not only its timing, so soon after the war while the world was still in shock, it was its scope. While later trials like Nuremberg trials focused on those at the highest levels of power, the architects of policy and war, Lüneburg did something different. It brought into the light those who operated death at the everyday level. The people victims saw daily. The ones who did not write history, but shaped how it was lived by tens of thousands. There were 45 defendants, including 16 women. That number alone carries meaning. It shows that the system was not a monolithic structure of men. It was layered, involving many types of people in many roles, and importantly, the court did not assign responsibility based on gender. A woman who wielded a whip, issued orders, cut rations, or unleashed dogs was not judged differently simply because she was a woman. The preparation for the trial took place under extremely difficult conditions. Many survivors were still severely malnourished, ill, even too weak to stand for long while testifying. Some who had survived the camps died in the weeks after liberation because their bodies were too exhausted. Records had been lost, burned, or fragmented. Yet investigators painstakingly pieced together the evidence, from photographs at Bergen-Belsen, medical reports, surviving documents, and above all, the testimonies of those who had lived through it. Among the witnesses, Ada Bimco was one of the most influential. As a prisoner doctor who had worked under brutal camp conditions, she offered a perspective different from many others. She was not only a victim, she was an observer. She saw more, understood the connections between actions and their consequences. Her testimony was not only emotional, it was structural. It helped the court see that these were not isolated acts, but part of a system. She described selections at Auschwitz, how people were sorted in seconds. She described decisions that seemed small, like cutting food rations, yet led to the slow deaths of dozens. And she described faces, Irma Grese with her cold calm, Elisabeth Volkenrath with her controlled, calculated authority. These details did more than establish actions, they revealed the psychology behind them. Another witness, Sofia Litwinska, added crucial pieces. She spoke of endless roll calls, where prisoners stood for hours in brutal conditions. She described beatings for the smallest failures, simply not having the strength to stand. She recalled cruel exercises, where prisoners were forced to repeat movements until collapse. Individually, such acts might seem like ordinary brutality within a prison. But together, described by multiple voices with the same internal logic, they formed a complete picture of how the system functioned. The prosecution's greatest strength was not a single piece of evidence. It was the consistency across independent testimonies. People who did not know each other described the same patterns, the same methods, the same habits. A dog unleashed in the same way, a whip used with familiar rhythm, a voice, a command, a gaze, repeated across memory. The probability that all were mistaken in the same way was extremely low. That consistency gave the case its weight. The defense did not remain silent. They raised arguments that would later become central questions in international law. They claimed the defendants were only following orders. They argued that witnesses might be unreliable due to trauma. They questioned the legality of applying laws retroactively to wartime actions. And for younger defendants like Irma Grese, they emphasized youth and indoctrination. These arguments were not without force. They touched real gray areas of responsibility. But the court reached a critical conclusion. Following orders could not be an absolute shield, because even within a system of command, there remains a space for choice, especially when actions exceed necessity. or occur without direct supervision. On witness reliability, the court emphasized consistency across independent accounts, and on legal grounds, it accepted that some crimes violate such fundamental principles of humanity that they cannot be justified simply because no prior law explicitly defined them. This marked a major step in legal thinking. For the first time in such a clear form, a court affirmed that there are standards beyond national law, that some acts, even if permitted by a state, can still be judged because they violate the foundation of human dignity. The trial also helped establish the principle of command responsibility. Elisabeth Volkenrath was a clear example. She did not need to personally carry out every act of violence to be guilty. If she had authority, the ability to intervene, the power to reduce suffering, and failed to act or maintained a system that caused suffering, she was still responsible. This expanded responsibility from individual acts to roles within a system. On November 17, 1945, the verdicts were delivered. 11 were sentenced to death, 19 received prison sentences, 15 were acquitted. Among those sentenced to death were 6 women. This sparked controversy at the time, not because their actions were less severe, but because society was not yet accustomed to seeing women as full agents of political violence. But the court did not yield. Evidence was judged by actions, not gender. Irma Grese was convicted for direct participation in selections and systematic violence. Elisabeth Volkenrath for both personal actions and command responsibility. Johanna Bormann for consistent testimony regarding her use of dogs as weapons and other acts of brutality. Petitions for clemency were later submitted to Bernard Montgomery, but all were rejected. There was no avenue for appeal within the legal framework at the time. The decisions stood. The Lüneburg trials were not a perfect conclusion to justice. Some prison sentences were later reduced in the shifting political landscape of post-war Europe. But despite its limitations, the trial achieved something essential. It forced the world to see that crime does not exist only in grand decisions. It exists in small, repeated actions, and those who carry them out must be held accountable. It also left a lasting legal legacy. The principle that superior orders are not absolute immunity. The principle that those in power are responsible for what happens under their authority. The principle that some standards rise above national law. These ideas would later develop in international courts, from the tribunals for the former Yugoslavia to Rwanda and into the work of the international criminal courts. But in Lüneburg, they appeared for the first time in a form that was deeply human. And then, after all the testimonies, the arguments, the verdicts, history moved into another moment. No longer words, no longer reasoning, but the execution of justice. A cold morning at Hameln prison, where 3 women who once walked through barracks and railway platforms took their final steps. There, justice ceased to be an abstract idea. It became an act. And their deaths, while unable to erase what had happened, became part of the legal legacy the world carried forward after the war. On the morning of December 13, 1945, at Hameln prison, there was nothing about the scene that resembled a grand historical event. No crowds, no speeches, no symbols of victory, just an enclosed space, thick walls, a narrow corridor, and a procedure prepared down to the smallest detail. Yet within that silence, a very particular chapter of history came to a close, not with final words, but with the last act of justice. Albert Pierrepoint, the British executioner responsible for carrying out the sentences, had arrived earlier to prepare. His work was not driven by emotion. It was technical. He measured height, weight, calculated the length of the drop to ensure death would occur as quickly as possible by breaking the neck. There is a paradox here that many later could not ignore. Even in punishment, justice operated through process, calculation, precision. Not to prolong suffering, but to end it decisively. That is the fundamental difference between a system that seeks to kill and one that seeks to conclude a crime that has been proven. Irma Grese was among the first to step forward, 22 years old, an age when, in many parts of the world, life is only beginning. But here she stepped into its final moment. According to records, she did not collapse. She did not beg. She did not resist. Standing on the gallows, her final words were, "Quickly." A short sentence, almost empty of emotion, yet one that has lingered in people's minds ever since. Was it defiance? Numbness so deep that no reaction remained? or simply the result of someone who had lived too long in a world where death had become ordinary, even her own no longer exceptional? No one can answer with certainty, but one thing is clear: her death was not the end of a monster separate from humanity. It was the end of a human being who had once been an ordinary girl, drawn into and ultimately absorbed by a system that turned power into a tool of destruction. Next came Elisabeth Volkenrath. There were no notable final words, no dramatic gesture, only a cold composure, much like the way she had carried herself throughout the trial. And yet that composure made the moment heavier, because it reflected a type of person history must always confront: those who do not need to shout, do not need to display extreme emotion, yet can make decisions that lead to the deaths of others. When she stepped onto the gallows, there was no dramatic turning point, only the continuation of a cold logic that had followed her from the barracks to the courtroom and now to its end. Johanna Bormann was the last, and in her case, according to some accounts, there was a difference: fear. A deeply human, instinctive reaction, one that those who had once faced her in the camps had perhaps never seen. The woman who had made weakened bodies tremble before trained dogs now stood before her own death with visible unease. That moment does not lessen guilt, but it reveals something else. No matter how much power a person holds, no matter how far they push others, when faced with their own death, they return to the fragile nature of being human. After the executions, there were no memorials, no graves marked for remembrance, no place left behind. The bodies were buried within the prison grounds, later cremated, the ashes scattered. This was not accidental. It was deliberate. The post-war world did not want to create sites that could become symbols for those who had participated in such crimes. No place for glorification, no place for distorted memory, only a quiet end. But if the deaths of these three women closed their personal stories, what mattered far more was what remained afterward. Not in physical form, but in how the world began to understand responsibility, power, and the limits of human behavior. The Lüneburg trial and its sentences helped shape a principle that today feels familiar, but at the time was still new. Superior orders are not an absolute shield. A person, even within a system, retains a portion of responsibility that cannot be transferred away. This does not mean all situations are equal, but it establishes that there are boundaries which, once crossed, cannot be excused by "I was only following orders." A second principle, just as important, is the responsibility of those in power. Elisabeth Volkenrath stands as a clear example. Not every crime requires a direct hand. Sometimes failing to act, failing to prevent, to intervene when one has the power to do so, is itself a form of participation. This idea would later become the foundation of command responsibility in international law. And perhaps one of the most uncomfortable but necessary legacies of this story is the collapse of a long-held illusion that women, for some inherent reason, stand outside political violence. The reality of the camps shows otherwise. When placed within a system that allows and encourages it, women too can become full agents of violence. Not because they are different from men, but because they, like all human beings, can be shaped by power, ideology, and circumstance. But above all, what this story leaves behind is not just legal principles. It is a warning that evil does not always arrive with clear signs. It can begin with small things, a classification of people, a way of naming that strips others of value, a decision that someone's suffering is acceptable. And when those things are repeated, organized, legitimized, then the perpetrators will appear, not as monsters from the beginning, but as ordinary people, step by step crossing boundaries they may not even realize they have passed. The deaths of Irma, Elisabeth, and Johanna cannot restore what was lost. They cannot erase the tens of thousands who died at Bergen-Belsen, or the millions across the entire system. But they do something else. They mark a point, a moment where the world says such acts will not disappear in silence. Those who commit them will be named, and the memory of what happened will not be buried alongside the nameless dead. And perhaps, in a world that is always changing, that is the most important thing history can do. Not to take revenge, but to remember, and to prevent it from happening again. When you step back and look at this entire story, what lingers is not just three names, not just specific acts, not just the verdicts that were handed down and carried out. What remains is something much harder to define, a quiet unease that comes from realizing the line between human beings and evil is not always as clear as we want to believe. Evil does not always arrive with signs that make us instantly recognize and reject it. Sometimes it begins with things that feel small, ordinary, even acceptable. A way of naming others that strips them of value, a decision that places the system above the individual, a habit of looking away from suffering that isn't our own. And then, step by step, as those things are repeated, reinforced, and legitimized, people can go further than they ever imagined themselves capable of going. Not because they were born different, but because they adapted, because they became accustomed, because that boundary no longer felt important. And that is exactly why stories like Bergen-Belsen do not belong only to the past. They are not just a closed chapter. They are a mirror, sometimes difficult to face, but necessary to look into. Because if we treat all of this as the story of monsters in history, we risk comforting ourselves with the idea that it could never happen again. But history has never worked that way. It does not repeat itself exactly, but the mechanisms, the logic, the ways people are drawn into systems can reappear in different forms under different circumstances. That is why memory does not exist only to horrify us. It exists to keep truth from being forgotten, to remind us that every person in any time stands before choices, no matter how small. And sometimes it is those small choices added together that create something far greater. If you've stayed with this story to the end, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. In your view, what is more frightening? Not the actions of individuals, but the way an entire system can make those actions feel normal. Your perspective might open up a new way of understanding for others following this story. And if you want to continue exploring deeper layers of history, stories not just to learn, but to reflect on, don't forget to subscribe to the History War channel. Because some things in the past, the more clearly we understand them, the better chance we have of not repeating them in the future.